Good afternoon, welcome. This is the last session. I'm the person between you and rum runners, dark and stormies, whatever you feel like today. My name is Paul Tico. I'm with the New York Department of State. I'm very pleased to serve as the moderator for the panel. Again, this is a 1-hour session. We have 3 speakers. 1, 2, 3, sort of, 4. 15 minutes apiece, please. There's a timer, but I think we'll skip that part. And then remaining time, we'll have a discussion and Q&A. So our session today is entitled Coastal Communities and Habitat, the Human Dimension, Aquaculture, Carbon, and Beyond. And I'm very much looking forward to this because we're going to look at not only the connections between the topics for the speakers, but their relationship to the human dimensions of coastal and ocean management, which is a really nice twist. With 3 specific topics that we see in the talks today: sustainable aquaculture, blue carbon and sea level rise, and carbon dynamics in salt marshes. These are very timely, very important topics. And if you think about them, you can imagine the subtopics, if you will, of technology, sustainability, socioeconomics, how human dimensions fits in with all this. So since you didn't pay money to hear me talk, we'll move on to our speakers. Our first speaker, Hannah Cooper from Maryland Sea Grant, and the title is Connecting Sea Grant, the National Centers for Coastal Ocean Sciences and Coastal Ocean Communities in the Mid-Atlantic to Improve Sustainable Aquaculture Siting and Development. Thank you, Hannah.
Hello, everybody. So like was said, I'm Hannah Cooper. I'm with Maryland Sea Grant. I'll be talking about this project today. This is a 5-year project. We have a lot of partners. The main project team is at Maryland Sea Grant, so that would be myself, Annie Schatz, who is the project coordinator, Frederica Moser, our director, and Jenna Clark, who's our senior programs manager. And as you can see, we collaborate with a lot of other folks across the Sea Grant network. So just to give a little background on the justification of why this project exists. So globally, aquaculture now contributes to over 50% of total seafood production. As you can see, around the 2010s, aquaculture surpassed capture fisheries in terms of the volume of aquaculture, or volume of seafood being produced globally. However, currently in the United States, we are still relying 70 to 85% of our consumed seafood being imported. And globally, we rank 18th in terms of aquaculture production. So looking at this, Congress has been really calling for increasing aquaculture in the United States, particularly doing this sustainably. And so as we've heard a lot today, we've heard about a lot of different things happening in ocean spaces that are not aquaculture. So as we're looking at offshore aquaculture, we have to consider the myriad of things that are happening in these ocean spaces. They are very busy. There's a lot going on. And with that, there's a lot of rules and regulations for using that space. So this kind of situation put us in a space that was really calling for dedicated marine spatial planning and a lot of collaboration amongst coastal ocean users in order to find out how we can sustainably increase aquaculture production in the United States. So NCOS, who you've heard mentioned a couple of times today, the National Centers for Coastal Ocean Science, they have a team that works on creating tools and other resources that kind of help marine spatial planning and specifically planning for aquaculture development. They partnered with the National Sea Grant Office to put out a funding call to connect the Sea Grant network and other coastal ocean users with NCOS and their aquaculture resources and tools. So the overall goal of this project was to build capacity and collaboration among these coastal ocean user groups in order to support environmentally, economically, and socially equitable aquaculture development throughout the United States. So throughout this project, we hope to extend the reach of NCOS aquaculture planning resources, connect NCOS, Sea Grant, and other coastal ocean user groups, and identify resource gaps for future NCOS products and collaborations. So the way that we are doing this is through a series of regional workshops. This began in summer 2022 with a workshop in the Mid-Atlantic, which I'll be talking more about later. Since then, we've also had a workshop in the Gulf of Mexico, in Louisiana, and in Southern California, in San Diego. And we are currently in the process of planning a workshop in Alaska, the Pacific Islands, and New England. So when we are going about developing these workshops, so the primary project team, like I mentioned, is at Maryland Sea Grant. We're collaborating regularly and heavily with NCOS. We also, for each of the workshops, connect with the local Sea Grant folks who are really our regional experts. And through that, we form a regional steering committee that is comprised of all the folks who we try and really have representatives from all the different sectors that might be involved in aquaculture, siting, and decision-making in the region. And then throughout the project as a whole, we have an external advisory committee that is folks throughout the nation that kind of advise on how we're progressing with the project, how we're making sure we're doing things effectively, and we also have a working group of NOAA folks that advise on the project as a whole. This is just a slide showing all the different Sea Grant programs that we are working with, folks that we're collaborating directly with, and folks who have provided support. So our objectives for each workshop, so across the workshops, we are hoping we present and explore aquaculture siting tools and data resources that NCOS has. We're introducing methods of co-creation and knowledge exchange, so talking about how NCOS can work with folks to actually get information and build the tools collaboratively so they are meeting everyone's needs. We hope to build understanding among participants of diverse perspectives, knowledge and expertise present in at the workshop. So kind of like the session we just had where we try and be intentional that folks are being brought to the table who should be there. And then we're looking at ways to improve and advance the utilization of co-creation in developing these tools. How can we improve existing and future tools? How we can best get tools to the folks that need them and want to use them, and then making sure that those tools are actually applicable to the folks that need them. So at the end of this project, so for each workshop, we'll develop a workshop report. So that will go to NCOS so that they can better understand the needs that exist regionally for aquaculture siting and development tools, and suggestions for current and future tool refinement and development. So. And then for their participants, we hope they will have learned about the tools that are available to them, had the opportunity to provide input on these tools, expanded their professional networks within the aquaculture sphere, and then broadened the awareness of diverse perspectives within aquaculture. So maybe engaging with folks who are part of the conversation, but maybe they haven't had the chance to interact with yet. So that was generally what the project is hoping to do. So now I'm going to talk specifically about the workshop we had in summer 2022 that was focused on the Mid-Atlantic region. This was the smallest of the workshops we've had so far because it was kind of our pilot to figure out what we were doing with the project. So we had 38 participants total, 30 were in person, and 8 joined us over Zoom. So one of the first parts of our days, we went over a case study, specifically talking about this idea of co-creation in aquaculture. So we had Matt Parker, who is one of our Maryland Sea Grant University of Maryland Extension agents, presented a tool that he has worked on developing, which is the online economic tool for oyster aquaculture. So this is a tool where farmers in Maryland can kind of input economic information, help them make decisions about planning a farm. And Matt has really worked over the past couple of years to develop this collaboratively with farmers in the state. So we had him present on this and present on the process of developing this tool. And then we split the group up into breakout discussions where we had folks share an example of a project where they felt they had engaged in co-creation, and then share kind of what worked well, what were some challenges, just to kind of get folks' wheels spinning about thinking about how we can do these processes, particularly as it relates to tool development. So some of the things that folks shared, so things that worked really well in co-creation is that the projects were needs-driven and based on real-world data, so they were grounded projects. building those relationships and trust with throughout the project partners, and if you're working with communities, building those trusts there. Making sure you have multiple sources of knowledge and expertise and leveraging those strengths across the different groups. And then being action-oriented and effective delegation of tasks, so making sure that these projects are completed effectively and successfully. And then some of the challenges folks shared was relying on anecdotal evidence or making assumptions that are not grounded in the reality of the situation. Duplicative efforts was a big one, which I'm sure all of you are aware of across different sectors, that if you have sometimes too many cooks in the kitchen and they're not communicating, that can get a little messy. And then also making sure that you're balancing folks' work and schedule demands, particularly if you're working with folks that are not being funded as part of the project, making sure you're conscientious about that. So in the second part of our day, we had 2 presentations on NCOS-specific tools. So the first one was WEMO, which is the wave energy model, and then we did the best harvest windows for Vibrio, which is also a harvest calculator. So we had folks from NCOS that presented on these tools and kind of what their purpose is and how they're used. And then following each of these presentations, we had kind of rotating breakout sessions where we set up 5 tables throughout the room with these different topics so that folks could rotate through and reflect on different aspects of the tools and how they thought they could be improved or what their strengths were. So I'm going to go over a few of these, not all of them. So in terms of tool functionality, strengths, and opportunities, I also tried to pull things that were kind of not specific to the tools, but broadly applicable. And I think you've heard from some of the folks that talked this morning that these are going to be similar successes and challenges that you hear, not just specific to aquaculture, but across marine spatial planning. So particularly not requiring technical expertise to use was a big one, that folks want tools to be accessible and something that you don't need to have a lot of former knowledge to know how to use. Quality data, again, we heard a lot about that this morning, making sure that the tool is reliable and you know that it's pulling from places that are gonna give you good information. And then demonstrated success and credibility, so seeing examples of projects that have successfully used those tools had good luck with them. And then some opportunities for future tool development and improvement, guides for how and when to use tools effectively. That was a big ask that came up a lot throughout the day. Increased data layers and inputs, which again kind of blends in with that quality data, making sure that you have as much and the right information to be making the decisions you want to be making. And then connections to other applicable resources, so may that be farm management tools, other relevant models, the research methods that were used to collect the data that you're looking at. And in terms of tool access and knowledge, folks really liked the idea of having hands-on training and kind of one-on-one mentorship and experience in figuring out how to use the tools, having webinars and instructional videos available, a quick start guide, and then this idea of a train the trainer where a couple folks could get training on the tool that could then spread that to their audiences. So that was the Mid-Atlantic workshop. Like I mentioned earlier, we have also since completed workshops in the Gulf of Mexico and California, and we're kind of looking at the results from that now. And so we're in the process of developing these regional workshop reports, and we have upcoming workshops, like I mentioned, in Alaska, the Pacific Islands, and New England. So this is the host of support that we've had throughout this project. We're really trying to make sure that everyone who has information and expertise in this area can be involved so that we are getting all the information and feedback that will be useful in making these tools better for everyone involved. So if you have any questions, this is the email of my colleague Annie, who, like I mentioned, is the coordinator for this project. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Hannah. We're now going to shift a little bit in the session to look at carbon as as an issue with 2 talks. First, Dr. Molly Mitchell from VIMS, assessing variability of blue carbon stocks across scales and their fate under sea level rise.
All right, so yeah, I'm gonna shift to talking about blue carbon now, and I just wanted to point out this is kind of an interdisciplinary project. So I'm a marsh ecologist. My other co-authors, Dr. Julie Herman, who's not here, she's a geologist, and Dr. Grace Chu, who is here at the end of the table, is a statistician. And so we're tackling this big question of how much carbon is out there, and we did this in collaboration with NRCS, and so they're all soil scientists. Okay, so what is blue carbon, and more importantly, why do we care about blue carbon? So blue carbon is carbon that is stored in marine systems. So this is opposed to these trees, which are green carbon, okay? And when you buy offsets, you know, you take an airplane and you buy carbon offsets, okay, it's green carbon almost always. But actually a lot of carbon is stored in the marine systems, and we're becoming more aware of the importance of it. And so this is a permanent removal of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. This is a number from NOAA, where they estimated 1 square mile of salt marsh stores the equivalent of 76,000 gallons of gas per year. And I did some math on that, and it's about 100 cars, okay? So it's important for us from a climate perspective. Climate modelers are really interested in how much carbon we're storing. And also there's the blue carbon market is starting to emerge. And so this is, instead of buying those green carbon offsets, you could buy blue carbon offsets, and it gives a market value to a salt marsh or a seagrass bed, okay, that didn't previously exist. Okay, so tidal marshes are important ecological systems, otherwise, not just in terms of carbon. They are currently responding to sea level rise. So what does that mean? So in this picture, we have that little edge of marsh there you can see around the creek. This marsh is not storing that much carbon right now. But with 1 foot of sea level rise, it will reach all the way, that marsh will reach all the way back to the house you can see in the back of that picture. So by 2035, 2040, the marsh will reach all the way back to that house. So in some places, we're having this big expansion of the ability to hold carbon. In other places, it's contracting. So understanding our carbon stocks now is important, but then understanding where our carbon stocks will be is also a much more difficult question, actually, but is important. Okay, so just really quickly, particularly we care about this on the East Coast because the mid-Atlantic portion of the East Coast has actually the highest rates of sea level rise along the Atlantic coast. It's not only rising, it's accelerating rapidly. So we went from 8 inches in the last century, we'll see 8 inches in the next 30 years. Okay, so a big shift in the way that things work. Okay, and what does this mean for accelerating? How does the accelerating affect the carbon sequestration? Okay, so this is a really big marsh. This is in Poquoson, Virginia. And the area outlined in yellow is the area that's marsh right now. So there's been like 100 years of carbon sequestering in the sediments here. It's really a thick, deep peat layer. Okay, but as sea level rises, that marsh moves across the surface, and it moves faster and faster and faster. So as we watch it rise, we get to this point eventually. So in 2100, we have a much smaller marsh in this case. And the red area that's outlined has only 40 years of sequestration. And the orangey area, okay, has only 20 years of sequestration. So we've gone from this huge area with more than 100 years of carbon being stored to these smaller areas with much, much less carbon stored in them. Okay, so this is why we're concerned about it. So the question was first, like, how can we get a handle on this? So we started off, we partnered with NRCS, like I said, to do sampling around the Virginia portion of the Chesapeake Bay and the northern part of North Carolina. And we picked out all these sampling sites. You see all the yellow dots there, or sorry, all the red dots, were all the sampling sites we picked out. And then COVID hit, and we couldn't go out on a boat for 2 years. So we pivoted a little bit, and we actually took those yellow dots are from published data from the 1980s, where they did similar sampling. And so we took that time to develop a statistical technique framework that could be used to analyze the uncertainty between this. So we have statistical framework. So this is a Bayesian analysis that was done by Grace. And if you have questions about it, she's really the best person to explain it to you. But the takeaway is that there are some things, so marsh type, the depth of the soil layer, the soil horizon, and the type of soil, the categorization of the soil, do affect, these are organic matter stocks, but they would be equivalent to carbon stocks. But most importantly, the location of the marsh affects it. So a marsh, you're going to be a better predictor of marsh carbon if you have data from a nearby marsh than if you have one from far away. Okay, so we've got the statistical method all sorted out. And so finally we're allowed back on the boat. And we went out, and the nice thing about the work that NRCS does is they have really nice boats, okay? They can drive up on, and these like long cores. So they take 2-meter cores. And 2-meter cores means you're actually getting below the depth of the organic matter. So these are 2 cores. This one is from offshore. You can see it has almost no carbon in it. And then this one is from the front edge of a marsh. And you can see all that nice black carbon peat in the front part. And then as we move down, it starts to get into those marine sediments that have less carbon in them. So we're looking at 2 scales of uncertainty. So we have all those different sampling sites. And then at each site, we're sampling from the offshore across the marsh edge to the back edge of the marsh. So we're looking at the change across the marsh as well. Okay, and this is the carbon content in green. The color indicates the darker green, the more carbon content. And you'll notice this goes up beyond Virginia, so we actually used cores that NRCS took along the entire Mid-Atlantic region. And what did we learn? We learned that carbon content does vary, and sometimes on very small spatial scales, like within the marsh, which makes it harder to predict. It's likely driven to a large extent by hydrology and geology. And we are still working on the question of how predictable that carbon content is. But I'm just going to show you some little bit of variation. So these are, a barrier island, and you can see they're very light green, and those have less carbon content than the marshes behind the barrier island, where they are less likely to roll over and change. So there is some geology that plays a part in this, so semi-predictable. Then these are data going across a marsh, okay, and so this is that front edge of the marsh, and you're moving to the back edge. And the interesting thing about this is the blue is the core carbon content, so that 2 meters, how much carbon was in that 2-meter core. And the red is just the soil organic matter in the upper horizon. And what you see is the soil organic matter doesn't vary very much. And so if our cores had only been a foot deep, we would have said it was the same, that the carbon content was the same across the marsh. But the carbon is much, much deeper on the front edge of the marsh, and so it's holding a lot more carbon. So when that front edge erodes, we're going to lose a large proportion of the carbon in that marsh, or when it drowns from sea level. Okay, and so getting to the question of how much carbon we have stored is actually a very complicated one, because we have the amount of carbon that's in the sediment, your percent soil organic carbon, and then how much is that integrated over the depth of which carbon is contained. And then how do we calculate that? And we have these 3 cores across a marsh, and how do we say how much carbon is in that marsh? And so for that, we used elevations, and we assigned everything within the same elevation as the core as having the same carbon content. But then if we were to go up from that, how much in a river system, how much carbon do we have? So then we have to know how much marsh we have. And so what that means is that these are the amount, the blue color, the darker blue, the more carbon is in that county, okay? And then the green color is telling you how much carbon was in each core. And so you can see over here we have this dark green core, but there's not very much marsh in that county there. So there's not as much total carbon content. Okay, so what are our next steps? So the next steps is really to use the statistical work that Grace has done to extrapolate the cores across the sampled region. So we can estimate like marsh carbon stocks across a large region, not per marsh. And then to look at, if we understand how much carbon we have in marshes and we understand how much carbon we expect to have in marshes, how do we actually bring that into our management strategy? So how do we manage marshes so that we keep that, carbon stock high, and preferentially protect areas where we expect to have high carbon stocks? All right, so thank you.
Our third and final presentation, sticking with our carbon theme, we have a fellow Delaware blue hen. Nice to see you. Rodrigo Vargas, where does the carbon go? Exploring carbon dynamics in a temperate salt marsh. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and it's a great introduction for the blue carbon. And I also have a disclaimer. So I was in the communication breakout session there, and I told myself, what are you doing? You have just to scratch a complete presentation, and knowing your audience now, just say something different. So actually, after thinking about that, I am, and also hearing some of the conversations here, I might skip some slides just for appropriate communication to the audience. So what I want to start saying is that blue carbon is important, as we heard in the last talk, and also there are emerging carbon markets. So one of the critical things is to accurately measure the carbon. And if you're going to sell these credits, you have to sell credits that are high-quality credits. And to do that, you have to be sure about how much carbon you have there and what is going to be the fate of that carbon. And to do that in salt marshes, it's a little bit complicated. Yeah? So I'm going to present about 10 years of my research in the next 13 minutes. Yeah. And it's just to say, this is a story about me as a scientist with the privilege that I have to do this work for 10 years now, whereas policymakers need the solutions now. So I totally recognize that privilege as a scientist, but I also want to bring the concern about the importance of accurately measuring things, especially under probably a carbon market credit, and we want to have a good quality of credits to sell or to buy, depending where you are. So So this is a work that I participated in 2018. Is the SOCR report. It's the State of the Carbon Cycle report. And what I want to bring it to your attention is to this area, the highlight area there, where the numbers of asterisks mean how certain we are on that number. So the more asterisks, more certainty on your number, and the less asterisks, the less certain you are. And if you can see how much carbon is in the tidal wetlands, in the sediments, like what we say. It's actually, we don't know much about that. The uncertainty is very high, same as how much is stored in the estuaries here. But also in the lateral transport, what is happening from the tidal wetlands to the estuaries. That lateral transport is also highly uncertain. So we have to think about two things. How much carbon is stored from the atmosphere coming down into the sediments? What is happening to that carbon? And how that carbon is being transferred laterally? And understanding that dynamic, it makes these ecosystems quite complex to study. So you have vegetation, you have rivers, you have lateral exchange, you have vertical exchange. You have spatial variability, which we saw in the previous section. We have temporal variability. You have to account in time, but also you have the drivers if you want to model the dynamics for forecasting and future predictions. So my work has been done in the St. John's Reserve, which is part of the Delaware National Estuarine Research Reserve. And I want to thank Kim, which was the first one that introduced me to the site, and I have known her for about 10 years. And this has been very welcoming, so thank you very much for that. But also very supporting for DENREC and the staff of this St. John's Reserve. Where is that? It's just a little bit north from here. It's about half an hour north, and just south of Dover. And we are part of different networks. So what I study there, I study how ecosystems breathe. So it's the exchange of mass and energy from the ecosystem to the atmosphere. And we are part of different networks. So we had a session in the morning about data governance. So I participate in data sharing for a long time, and I will be very happy to share my experiences with a different community that I understand it's not necessarily the ocean community. But here are names, some of the names of the networks such as Ameriflux, Phenocam, SpecNet, and we have been sharing data for the last 20 years or so. We have many problems. We try to expand the networks to other places. We have certain policies that fail. Some ones are better than others, but we now adopted a policy of open data and some licenses for data sharing, specifically to be completely open and for complete use of the data. And that's an aerial view. It's very similar to what you can see around here. And we use multiple sensors and multiple techniques to measure how the ecosystem breathes and to identify where the carbon goes. Specifically, we use what is called the eddy covariance technique. It's just how the ecosystems breathe, the exchange of mass and energy, as I was saying, from the ecosystem back into the atmosphere and vice versa. So in other words, we can measure how much carbon is coming in or how much carbon is going out. And when I talk about carbon, I talk about CO2 and also methane. So we have talked about CO2, but methane is a very important greenhouse gas, especially if we're talking not only about carbon, but the net effect of potential carbon storage or release. And the other aspect was, is that we should study not only during the growing season when the plants are growing, but also what happened during the winter time. So this was our first surprise in this story. And it was that we expected that this ecosystem was a net carbon sink because the plants are growing and they are getting carbon into the soil, and therefore the sediments are growing. But actually, when we measure throughout the year, we got a surprise. And the reason is that plants do photosynthesis and they capture CO2 during the growing season, but when the plants are not active, they respire. So some of that carbon goes back into the atmosphere. But also when we measure methane, methane in these ecosystems is not a prevalent emissions to the atmosphere, but they are small and consistent. And those emissions continue during the winter. So when you don't have plants, and plants are respiring, when soils and sediments are respiring, and also you have methane emissions, then what we found is that the ecosystem is a net carbon source to the atmosphere. And this is a problem. And why? Because that's not what we were expecting. And also we don't have much data to compare to other ecosystems because most people have been focusing only during the growing season. But there was this inconsistency about, well, that's not what the literature says. We see that there's a lot of carbon in the sediments. Like, why we're measuring that these are just sources to the atmosphere? So we actually waited like 5 years to publish this because we were not sure about what we were sure about what we're measuring. So it was a learning process, but we're confident, and now with 10 years of measurements, that it seems that this ecosystem is consistently a carbon source to the atmosphere. And this is something that we need to be aware of and test in other ecosystems and other salt marshes across the mid-Atlantic, especially when we include CO2 and methane as well. So talking about methane, CO2, the scientific community has spent a lot of time modeling CO2, and we can do more or less a good effort about that. But for methane, things are very complicated, no? And this is where we are now, and I don't want to go and explain all this, but there's a lot of relationships that are needed to explain methane. And this becomes challenging, but also very exciting in terms of forecasting. So we had previous talks in the morning about weather forecasting, and that is fascinating, yeah? But weather forecasting is about 30 years ahead of ecological forecasting. So if we want to forecast ecological processes such as CO2 sequestration or methane fluxes, we have a big problem ahead of us. No? First of all, we are 30 years behind of weather forecasting. And second, we have to represent nature in this case, which doesn't seem to be that easy to represent. So it's something that we have to work on. But again, I want to bring your attention of methane as well for these specific ecosystems. So then I told you that we were measuring how these ecosystems breathe, but we were not sure about our measurements because we didn't have anything to compare with. So then we pair with other scientists and we use different techniques. And this was a project with NASA, the CARAFE platform, which stands for Carbon Airborne Flux Experiment. Basically, it's just an airplane flying on top of the salt marshes and measuring CO2 and methane fluxes from the aircraft. And we compare those measurements with what we were measuring at our study site and across different sites. So the lines that you see there are just paths across different areas in this region of the world. And what we found is that for CO2, what the aircraft was measuring, it was more or less okay, similar to what we were measuring at the site level. But for the methane fluxes, it was a discrepancy. And why is that? Is that landscapes are not uniform. No, we also have our salt marshes here, but then you have a farm, or you have other forests, and it just gets a little bit complicated, the signal for interpretation. So on the one side, it's, we can be measuring CO2 okay at the site level, but also with airplanes, but methane, again, becomes a little bit complicated. So how we measure methane, and we think about protocols and other other protocols for measuring methane in salt marshes, and most people will not have the opportunity to have an eddy covariance tower, meaning measuring methane or CO2 continuously. Most people will go and use chamber measurements, so they will go and do discrete measurements, put them here, and then come the next week and put it there, and then come the next week, and so on. So we did a comparison between these traditional techniques of chamber measurements with continuous measurements using the eddy covariance technique. And what we found is that things are not that good. So what the chambers are measuring is not what the eddy covariance is seeing. And you can see here some of the things about what you calculate the annual sum calculated by chambers or with the eddy covariance technique. There could be an overestimation or underestimations. When we look specifically for respiration and photosynthesis, well, more or less could be okay, 10% off, but for methane, we're about 70% off. And if you look at respiration from sediments, there is also a huge discrepancy between 23 to 70% off. So here adds another layer of complexity where to measure and when to measure. So when do we want to measure? As often as possible. Where? Well, depends on which part of the salt marsh you are. So I don't have a good solution to tell everyone where they should measure, but the surprising part of what we found is that you need to measure as frequent as possible, because if you don't do that, then you miss things. And we continue our experiments doing auto chambers, so basically leaving these systems to measure continuously in different places in the marsh. And we try to compare these measurements with discrete measurements. And some people have observed that there are certain patterns in these ecosystems because they are driven by the tides, or because they are driven by the day and the night changes in temperature. And maybe for CO2, it follows that. The day and night, it is driving metabolic processes. Tides are driving the pushing of the gases for CO2. But for methane, we didn't. And what we found in methane is that it might be lower fluxes, and then will be high flux, and then lower flux, and will be high flux. And it has an implication when you measure. And the problem is that if you go and put a chamber there, at one discrete chamber, you can, just by chance, have a very large flux or a very low flux. And if you only do that a few times, and then you multiply that times your hours, the days, and the years, then you can end up with a very, very different number. So again, where the carbon goes and how much carbon is getting in or out of these ecosystems, it's very important to figure out the real value of carbon sequestration of these systems. Now, in terms of lateral fluxes, this is also important. I have only been talking about vertical fluxes, but carbon comes in and out laterally because we have tides as well. So how much carbon is coming in, how much carbon is coming out? And what we were able to do again is measuring in an automatic way how to measure the concentration of carbon in the water, but also the fluxes from the water to the atmosphere. And the take-home message here, again, going back to this the methane story, is that we found surprisingly high methane concentrations in the water. And where is this methane coming from? And where is that methane going to? That is something that we were very interested in. First, we haven't solved the question of where that methane is going to. Is this methane going to go all the way out to the coastal ocean? We don't know that yet. But we were thinking about where this methane is coming from. And this was a little bit confusing because these sites, they have been neglected to being studied by methane because supposedly there should not be methane production in these sites. Why? Because you have salt intrusion. And by having salt, you have sulfate reduction. And by doing that, you should not be producing methane. So why you even bother to study? But we were finding these methane fluxes small, but they were there. But when we went down into the sediments and we measured the concentration of methane in those sediments, the concentrations were huge, huge, and they should not be there. And the problem there is like why they were being produced there and where that methane was going. So we have several hypotheses that, well, methane can be oxidized, no? It's like that meaning that microbes were chewing that methane, and that methane was being now transformed into CO2, and that CO2 was coming out, and that's why we were not seeing that methane. Or maybe that methane was just going to stay there in the sediments for a very long time, no? There were different possibilities. So we started studying some of those. And first we thought that maybe the methane is being released to the atmosphere because of plants, that they are just serving like straws, connecting the soil to the atmosphere. And we didn't find that. That's methane is coming out from those plants, but not that much. Maybe methane is oxidized, as I was telling you, and then this is not going to be so simple. And what we found is that no, methane is not oxidized. And that was really a bummer because we thought that it was just going to solve the story. By the way, this is the work of a PhD student, and I told her like this is going to be very simple, and actually turned out to be a complicated story. But that was also frustrating because methane is not being oxidized. Well, what about the story of methane being old? Maybe that methane stays there for a very long time. Well, no, that methane is actually quite young. Yeah. So what is that methane going? Where is that methane going to? Because the methane is not going out, it's not staying there, yeah? What is happening and why that methane is there? So what we thought is that because of the tides, that methane is being produced there and then it's moving laterally into the channels and then moving away, yeah? How far away, we don't know that yet. But the one thing that we were not able to solve is like why that methane is there initially. And we did some microbial analysis and we did some other analysis to figure this out. And this actually was surprising because it's breaking a paradigm. And again, the paradigm was saying that methane should not be produced there because of sulfate reduction. But there is not only one pathway for methane production, there are multiple ones. And here, and I put my hat as a terrestrial ecologist, is like I should be reading the ocean community's literature. And what the ocean community has found is that there is another pathway for methane production in the ocean, which is methylmethanotrophy. And that methylmethanotrophy actually is present in salt marshes, in this connectivity between the coastal terrestrial interfaces. And we found that those microbes are there, and we found evidence that methylmethanotrophy is probably responsible for producing methane in these ecosystems. So my take-home message for here is that we have to be very careful about how we measure carbon. We want to be sure that we measure it correctly because if we're going to use those measurements for credits, we want to have these credits of high quality. We have to understand the connectivity between the ocean and land, and not lateral movements, but also vertical movements. And we have to have hopefully continuous measurements in the winter and in the summers to understand the whole seasonal cycle of these fluxes. With that, I just want to say thank you again for the sponsors and the group, and thank you for having me here.
Thank you, Dorga. Thank you to all the speakers. We are right on time. We have about 10 minutes or so for questions and discussion. We know we have the mic runners about. And any question, of course, is open to an individual or the group. Yes, sir.
For our last speaker, you said that carbon's not accumulating in marshes. How do you explain the color differences between the two core samples that we saw?
So the color doesn't necessarily mean carbon. So you can have a black sediment for a different reason than just carbon. That's just a simple answer, no? More complicated would be that if there is a discrepancy between a creation, an increase in carbon in the sediments, between what the actual ecosystem is is capturing vertically. I don't know if that makes sense, what I said. So color doesn't mean carbon. I know you want to add that.
Yeah. Okay. So the color is the organic matter, which has carbon in it, and it is a high carbon environment. But so we know marshes are capturing carbon because even living shorelines are continuing to capture and build carbon sediment. But a lot of flux studies have actually not been able to figure out that loophole. The flux studies frequently end up saying that that the marshes are respiring as much as they're capturing. So I don't know what the discrepancy is, honestly, because we see the carbon build up in the sediment, but flux studies frequently don't find it. So there's a missing loop. So hopefully you're finding that missing loop in yours.
Yeah, but I think the importance, again, I'm going to emphasize, the color of a sediment, just color, doesn't mean that there is carbon. That is very important. Second, it's absolutely right. You can have carbon there, no? But you have to understand if that carbon is younger or old. It could be in other places that carbon is older, and it's just happened that the ecosystem is not sequestering carbon anymore. That could be one option. The other option would be what I just described, where it could be that it seems that in the sediments are increasing, but the fluxes are not showing that. That is a loophole that we have to figure it out. Maybe it's just the lateral fluxes that is happening. So there is a fast replacement of the carbon that is actually stayed in the sediments versus the carbon that is stored and being lost laterally. And you have to think about this in two ways. How much is in the sediments, but also how much carbon actually is removed from the atmosphere. In my opinion, if we want to get into the actual carbon credits, we have to be sure about how much carbon is net removed from the atmosphere. That's my opinion.
Yeah, for the first speaker, you said that when with sea level rise, that some of that marsh becomes flooded, and you said it was then lost. And I could understand why it would lose function in carbon capture, but why is the stored carbon lost? Isn't it stored at the bottom? I mean, eventually to become oil even or whatever, 10,000 years?
Is this on? Okay, yeah. So, yeah, no, it's a good question. So the stored carbon mostly is lost because a lot of the front edge erodes, and as the grass dies and there's nothing structurally to start holding the sediment in place, it'll start to wash off from the top to the bottom. So some of it will stay, and some of it will be lost. And that's actually one of the kind of big questions is when it erodes and it goes into an estuary, how much of it is then returned to the atmosphere. But how much of it, actually some of it does seem to go offshore and is buried in deep marine sediments. So that's a different storage pool, a different reservoir. And there's no good numbers yet, unfortunately, and it's probably very much estuarine dependent on how much is lost and how much is preserved in a different pool, a different reservoir. Yeah.
Was better articulated than what I was trying to think of. But like, if you've spent some time in these systems, you'll see pieces of marsh that have cleaved off, and you'll see, oh, there's a lot of organic material that's rich there, and you picture that's happening over thousands of years, and there must be a lot of carbon buried out there from, like peat, big peat and stuff, and so. Like, don't we get to keep that? But it sounds like there's a lot of uncertainty about measuring the amount of flux and how much it comes out. And it sounds like maybe we're hopeful that we're overestimating that flux. But can you just riff on that a little bit?
On whether we're overestimating the loss of
How confident are we in the rate of sequestration versus the rate of flux out of the system?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. So you saw those dots, right, of the salt marshes that we've sampled for carbon. Okay, so those marshes, only a very small fraction of marshes have been sampled, right? Okay, those marshes have had a lot of sampling compared to the offshore reservoirs of carbon. So we have, very little idea of that. And it really depends on how much things break up and how much microbial activity happens in the water column, how much is returned in that portion of it to the atmosphere. And I don't know, you've done lateral. Have you looked at estuarine heterotrophy, autotrophy?
There was a paper published, I believe, early this year or late last year in Nature Climate Change, and they claim that the uncertainty is 100%. So we basically don't know.
Will Eisenberg, Coastal Zone Management Program. Just so clearly, there's uncertainty debates around carbon stocks in these blue carbon stocks. How would you compare that, if you are familiar with that, to the terrestrial green carbon stocks? Is it the same conversation going on there, and there's just more scrutiny here, or is it we just have more certainty there because we've had more years of studying it? Just any elaboration on that would be helpful.
So in some ways it's more certain. The green carbon market has been up and running for a long period of time, so there has been a lot of work done on terrestrial systems. The longevity of it, I think, is more of the question in the green carbon market. And so so things stored in marine sediments don't degrade very easily, right? And so as long as they don't change and erode or something like that, right, there's a certain amount of longevity storage there. But trees, of course, do die and fall down or occasionally are cut down and, so I think that's more where the uncertainty is. I do think they have a better grasp on how much is being stored within the plants themselves. Yeah.
So I know the uncertainty, we've talked a lot about that, but we at the moment have, what people are describing as once in a generation funding opportunities to conserve, in CZM programs and NEARS programs. So what data is best for us to use when we're trying to make these decisions right now? Because now is when matters in that context.
Okay, so from my perspective, marshes do a lot of things besides storing carbon. And so there is no loss in preserving a wetland, whether you're getting the carbon, the carbon storage that you think you're getting or not. I think there's a lot of really good reasons. Yeah, it helps, nutrient removal, sediment removal, as well as carbon storage, habitat, all kinds of good functions. So my feeling is that we preserve the marshes for all the things they do, and the carbon storage is a bonus. Yeah. Do you have any thoughts you want to add?
I fully agree. I just think that if we narrow the story to carbon, it is limiting ourselves for all these other benefits. And if we limit ourselves on the carbon story, I think we have to be very careful in how we sell that story for climate benefit, because that very narrow part of the story is very uncertain. So that is why we have to preserve for other benefits that are non-market goods that are very difficult to value, but the overall benefit, it is good.
So just following up, because there's also the climate pollution reduction grants that are really designed for this purpose specifically. Is there no reliable data on this as far as you guys are concerned?
Okay. I can mention something about, it's a tough one. I can mention something about the green carbon. So we're working on a project discussing these carbon credits. And what we did is we look at all the protocols that are out there for people that are actually selling those credits. And this is a big problem, because if you as a consumer buy a credit, or you pay someone for a credit, and then you figure out that what you paid for is not there, it's not stored, then we have a problem. And who is the one that made wrong the calculation? Was it Delta? Was it the broker? Was it the landowner? Who? And that right now is not very well regulated for many reasons. The green carbon world, now they have been thinking about certain things, but it is not there yet. I think for the blue carbon, it is even more complicated. And I think this community has the opportunity to start putting those standards about what is the importance of these ecosystems. What is the connectivity to these ecosystems? And start putting those standards about what is the requirements that we need to understand for preservation, for management, for policy, but also for the economics that are linked to all these problems. I know I didn't answer the question.
So I guess the only thing I'd add to that really quickly is there's a difference between this carbon already stored in the ground and the carbon that's being stored in the ground. And we have a better grasp, even though there's a lot of uncertainty, on what's already there. So in the blue carbon market, there's been some discussion of, like, if you could stop the erosion of a marsh, can you then count the non-erosion, right, as a credit, as a benefit? And that, at least as a stock, exists. And you're not making any assumptions about how much additional carbon is being captured in that. So I think there are some things that are more certain, but there is still a lot of uncertainty, yeah.
Well, thank you all for your excellent questions. There's so much more to discuss on this topic, like policy and management implications and technological advances and so on, but we'll get to that the next time. So thank you very much to our speakers and all of you, and I'll turn it over to Tony.
Well, thank you to that panel. They were very brave, actually. So, I understand that good science leads you to ask better questions, and that's one of its advantages. But sometimes I also feel like, no, I didn't want to hear that, Rodrigo. So, it's hard for us. Everybody in this room wants to love their salt marshes, and now they're going to all look at them as non-carbon absorbing, methane emitting places. So, but I really want to thank you for that. But I might hold off on reading your article a little bit. No, but this is really, it is really pretty important, because I do think that also raises the concepts that we are thinking much more different about ocean ecosystems, and we're looking at things like blue carbon markets or marine CDR. These are issues that are really emerging in our area that we really didn't think about as we were thinking about it from just an environmental management perspective. So really thinking about it from these broader perspectives of what role they do play within this broader climate carbon framework, which is really happening a little bit domestically and internationally. I think that's pretty important to get a handle it. And there's only an upside when there's 100% uncertainty. So every project you do, graduate students, is going to be good, because you get it down to 96, 97, and you can keep moving in the right direction. So with that, I just, a couple little summaries. I think the most important thing is to remind everybody tomorrow we're going to start a little bit earlier, so 8 o'clock for coffee and breakfast. We're going to start promptly at 8:30, so please do come. We have a great plenary speaker tomorrow to really contextualize us a little bit within Delaware and the small but mighty state that we're in. So really please come early for that presentation, and we'll get in to the rest of the day. A couple of thoughts. I'm sure you'll have more. Again, we have recorded this, and we'll have all of the presentations available afterwards. But a couple of thoughts a little bit, and I'm going to actually, in my mind, start in reverse, because I really want to start from the equity perspective, because I think almost every meeting I've been to in my career, they stand up and say, and how about equity? And how do we do this? But I really want to think about this entire meeting from an equity lens, and think a little bit about how we've absorbed the information, and maybe how some of the way we think about approaching our problems within the marine and coastal space might not necessarily be from an equity lens, because there's a lot of things like expertise and experts and science and thinking about ocean as a place that's distant and unknowable, and we need to think about that. So I do think we can maybe learn a little bit from sort of where we ended up, the equity discussion, and thinking about building community around the ocean, and how the communities that we speak to tend to be a little bit self-reinforcing. So whether it's bringing some of the science we have in some of these panels into communities, or really starting from a community building space and then figure out where the expertise is that relates to those community problems. So that's sort of one thought I had a little bit, but really, kudos to Marco for continuing the equity discussion, because I think it's one that we're all benefiting from. I did have a couple of takeaways, again, from the beginning about Delaware, small and mighty, but really they did talk about some of the opening remarks about how they're thinking about equity, but how they're also thinking about their state ocean plan, and thinking about one of the things they said right from the beginning, two-way communication. That was the way they're thinking about it, and that's also the way I think a lot of our discussions need to continue to move forward, about that two-way communication. So it's not just the experts speaking to us about what we need to know about this issue, but trying to figure out where those applications are. I do think we had a lot of really fantastic discussions. We were placed in a place by Avalon's opening remark of collaboration and also ecosystems, and thinking about people, places, and prosperity. So I do think that came up consistently in different ways throughout all of the presentations. So we heard a lot about geographical space and places, and thinking about how we have knowledge and can access knowledge about that through the marine spatial planning work. I think there was a lot of really sort of reminding ourselves about the people. I mean, that's again the equity issue about this, and also accessing that information in a variety of different ways. I think we heard a lot of things about, again, I'm going to go back a little bit to the poster sessions, again, sort of thinking about that. We can, again, oh, look, we have students doing posters. No, no, no. These folks are really the ones who are going to be taking everything we're talking about, who are going to improve Rodrigo's science and answer some of the questions that he's asking us. So I do think we also need to front youth and other voices within the work that we do moving forward to also sort of deprofessionalize knowledge and deprofessionalize knowledge development in a way that really both folks that bring traditional knowledge, we heard about that in several contexts, to the discussion as well, and I think that will re-engage us with communities as well. I think there's some issues that I heard a little bit from also thinking about how sort of this, it's a culture of data sharing. I mean, that was the thing. Again, I'm trying to bring this back a little bit. I think this culture of data sharing, I think those were fantastic proposals that were really over my head technically. But when we're talking about the data governance sessions, I mean, really thinking about data governance as an enabling condition. And particularly in an atmosphere and in a place that Nick Napoli observed is we are at an incredible point for ocean data. Not enough. We all know that goes, what, we're 300 years to somebody behind atmospheric sciences and modeling. Nonetheless, we are at a pretty remarkable place where ocean data is coming in fast and furious in ways that it hadn't been before, and also our ability to analyze that. So how do we think about this culture of data sharing? How do we think about this culture of data development so it is accessible? You know, so thinking about that, and some of the experts in the room might understand how that actually works, but mostly it's kind of like your iPhone. Nobody really wants to know how that works. You know, and I'm serious, at some point it all seems disruptive and uncomfortable and difficult, but eventually if we think about the questions that if it solves people's problems, it really will be something that will become background. If we get some of these models right, if we think more about what they're trying to questions, what they're trying to address, I think that's something that I took away a little bit from some of the discussions today. I do think also thinking about some of the things that, that we heard about for the scenario planning efforts. That was a really interesting discussion for me because they were trying to get communities around, fisheries communities. They're not like a kumbaya group, right? They got issues, you know, so they were always trying to think about that. But really, what I heard was they took a broad scenario planning where they had that 4-quadrant analysis, difficult, easy framework, and they said, these are incredibly complex issues, but maybe we can agree on certain trends. Maybe we can agree on some future scenarios, and we can have a discussion then about how we might want to take and make some choices now. And then we might need better and more detailed science about it. So I do think things like scenario planning and future-based lenses can be ways that we can bring communities together and not bring them from all the complexity, but bring them from the common shared understanding of what that complexity is telling us about what is possible, what is difficult, what is easy, what is hard, and then how do we then figure out how to implement it in a more detailed way. I think there's a lot of discussion a little bit also about some of the synthesis products and thinking more about, I really like Jesse's point about trying to add value. A lot of our science and a lot of science is around solving a very specific problem. How do we address a very specific issue? But how do we really use that information in ways that have multiple benefits? Whether it's a multiple benefit of a wetland, whether it's a multiple benefit about thinking about how the data is used in different ways, whether it's about the data collection that's done for offshore wind, but why does every frickin' developer need to generate the same information and give it to BOEM and, you know, try to figure that out? How do we actually think about how we can create a system, and we heard a lot about systems in which there is not this duplicity, where there is more transparency and more sharing of data so that we can actually have multiple values around some of this issue. And I think some of the open data movements and things like that are saying, wait a second, there is great potential in thinking about that because people will figure out solutions and problems in a way that they can't if we continue to develop information in a way that's around very particular decisions. And this came in our equity decision. But one of the main things about equity is we all have our job to do. And our job isn't to build a community. Our job is to get that permit. Our job is to do those issues. So I really feel like there was a little bit of themes that I heard running through today. You might hopefully have different and more informed ones than I have. But really think about how we build this as a community in the Mid-Atlantic. I really take away, this is a place that has the most variation of temperature of any place in the world. You know how unique that makes our system? We have offshore wind happening. We have maritime commerce happening. We have incredibly productive fisheries that are struggling, but still probably the best managed in almost the world in the Mid-Atlantic. So how do we take advantage of this place and take the lessons that we've learned today and are going to learn tomorrow a little bit more to sort of build community and work through groups like Marco and other groups to move forward? So that's my general takeaways from today, and I'll digest them, but happy to any friendly amendments over drink tonight at the, where is it, the Wheelbarrow? The Wheelhouse? It's not in my wheelhouse, the Wheelbarrow. So anyway, so that's all I got. Is there anything else? Is there any concluding things you want, Avalon? Good. Great. Okay. See you tomorrow or tonight.